Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. The train rocked gently as it pulled away from the platform, a low metallic rhythm settling in beneath everything else. Priya stood near the door, at first holding the pole with one hand, her bag resting against her hip. The car wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. People were spaced out in their own small bubbles. Eyes down, headphones on each body, moving with the shared motion of the ride. She found an open seat by the window and sat tucking her feet slightly under the bench. Outside, the city slid past in layers brick, glass, concrete, then a blur of lights as the train picked up speed. The motion was familiar enough to be comforting, but not enough to feel like home. Priya was 28 and worked as a data analyst for a company she liked well enough. The work made sense to her. Patterns, numbers, quiet focus. It was the rest of life that often felt harder to place. Conversations that moved too fast. Rooms where everyone else seemed to know where they belonged. Decisions that felt heavier than they looked on paper. She rested her forehead briefly against the cool window glass and watched her reflection drift in and out over the darkening city. It always surprised her how clearly she could feel present and out of place at the same time. Like she was there doing everything required but slightly off-center, as if she'd arrived without the final instruction. The train slowed near the next stop, brakes sighing softly. A few people stood to leave. Others took their seats. The space adjusted around her without asking. Earlier that day, Priya had been in a meeting where everyone spoke easily, tossing ideas back and forth like they were all holding the same map. She had followed along, contributed when needed, nodded at the right moments. No one excluded her. No one questioned her place. And still, when the meeting ended, she'd felt the familiar tug of doubt. A quiet sense that she was filling a seat that belonged to someone else, that eventually someone would notice the mismatch. She pulled her jacket closer around herself, not because she was cold, but because the pressure felt grounding. The train swayed again, steady and predictable, as if reminding everyone inside that they were being carried whether they tried to control it or not. Priya thought about a puzzle she'd worked on as a kid, one of those with hundreds of pieces scattered across the table. She remembered the feeling of scanning the shapes, convinced there had to be one missing. She'd checked the box, the floor under the couch. Only later did she realize the piece had been there the whole time, just turned the wrong way. That memory surfaced now without effort as the train moved her through tunnels and open air. She wondered how many times she'd treated herself like a missing piece when she was simply not yet oriented. The train emerged above ground lights spilling in through the windows. Buildings gave way to trees for a few moments, their branches streaking past. The rhythm of the ride smoothed her breathing without her noticing. In and out. Slow, uncounted breaths. Priya watched the people across from her. A woman scrolling through her phone. A man staring at the floor, jaw relaxed. Someone humming quietly beneath their breath. None of them seemed to be proving anything. None of them looked like they were trying to justify their presence on the train. They were just here. She felt a soft ache behind her ribs, the kind that came from wanting to belong without knowing where to place that want. For years, she'd believed belonging was something you earned by fitting in just right, saying the right things, choosing the right path, becoming a version of yourself that made sense to everyone else. But the train didn't ask for that. It didn't care who deserved a seat. It simply moved, carrying every passenger equally regardless of their stories. Priya shifted slightly and let her shoulders drop. The tension there eased just a fraction. She didn't feel suddenly included. She didn't feel whole in a dramatic way. What she felt was quieter. She felt less separate. The train slowed again, pulling into another station. Doors opened. Air rushed in. A few passengers stepped out. Others stepped in. The shape of the car changed, but the ride continued. Priya realized then how often she'd imagined herself as an extra piece, one that didn't quite fit anywhere. But nothing here felt like extra. The train had room. The bench had room. The moment had room. She rested her hands in her lap, palms open, fingers relaxed. The window reflected her face again, softer now, less questioned. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to solve herself before the next stop. Maybe she wasn't missing. Maybe she was already part of the picture, even if she couldn't see the full image yet. The thought stayed with her as the train carried her forward, steady and patient, into whatever came next. The train continued on, carrying Priya through neighborhoods she recognized and others she only knew by name. The movement was steady now, familiar enough that her body no longer braced for it. She rested back against the seat and let the window support the side of her head, watching lights pass in long, gentle streaks. She noticed how her thoughts had slowed, not disappeared, just softened around the edges. They no longer lined up to argue her place in the world. They floated in and out like reflections on the glass, present but not demanding. For most of her life, Priya had believed belonging was something external, a place you arrived at, a group that opened itself to you, a moment when everything finally clicked and you could say, "This is where I fit." Until then, she assumed she was incomplete, waiting for the missing piece that would make the picture whole. But sitting on the train surrounded by strangers who were not really strangers at all, she felt something shift. No one here knew her story. No one needed to. And still she was carried just the same. The idea settled quietly. Maybe belonging wasn't about fitting perfectly into a shape. Maybe it was about being held even temporarily by the same movement, the same moment, the same direction. The train dipped back underground, the windows turning into mirrors again. Priya caught her reflection and studied it without judgment. The face looking back didn't appear unfinished. It looked attentive, alive, in motion. She thought again about that childhood puzzle, about how the piece she'd been searching for had never been gone, only turned the wrong way. How easy it was to mistake orientation for absence. How often she'd done the same with herself. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She didn't reach for it. Whatever it was could wait. Right now, there was nothing she needed to confirm. The train slowed, then picked up speed again. The sound of wheels against rails created a low, even rhythm, almost like breathing. Priya matched her breath to it without trying. In, out, carried forward. She felt the familiar urge to evaluate herself begin to fade. Not because she had answered all her questions, but because the questions no longer felt urgent. There would be time for them later, if they mattered at all. When the announcement for her stop played, she didn't feel the usual jolt of uncertainty. She stood, moved toward the door, and stepped off with the others. The platform was cool and quiet, the air heavier than inside the car. The train doors closed behind her, and with a soft, mechanical sigh, it continued on without pause. Priya watched it disappear into the tunnel lights, shrinking until there was only darkness again. She felt a small pang then, not of loss, but of recognition. The train hadn't left her behind. It had simply completed its role. She walked up the stairs and out into the night. The street above was calm, washed in yellow light. A few people passed by, each absorbed in their own direction. No one questioned her presence. No one measured her pace. As she walked home, Priya realized something else. She had spent years trying to locate the place where she would finally belong, as if it were fixed and waiting. But belonging wasn't stationary. It moved. It shifted. It appeared wherever she allowed herself to be fully present without shrinking. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, setting her bag down gently. The apartment greeted her with familiar silence. She didn't rush to fill it. She let it stay quiet. Priya sat on the edge of the couch for a moment, hands resting loosely in her lap. Her body felt heavier now, in the way it does when it trusts the ground beneath it. The day loosened its grip. The doubts that usually followed her into the evening didn't seem to know where to land. She didn't suddenly feel complete in a dramatic sense, but she no longer felt like a piece waiting to be found. She lay down and let her breath settle. The image of the puzzle faded, replaced by something simpler. A sense of being part of a larger movement, even without seeing the whole picture. Nothing needed to click into place tonight. Nothing needed to be resolved. Priya closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest inside the truth that had been there all along. She had never been missing. She had always been part of the whole. Fog doesn't arrive all at once. It spreads, very slowly. So slowly that if you're not paying attention, you only notice it once. Everything ahead feels a little less clear than before. Ava returned to her hotel room close to midnight. The long flight and the time change had left her body tired in a strange way. Not quite sleepy, not fully awake either. The hotel room felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Soft yellow light, curtains drawn. She set her small suitcase against the wall, took off her shoes, and sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Ava was 29, a flight attendant used to flight maps, clear routes, destinations decided ahead of time. But when she wasn't in the air, when there was no schedule right in front of her, her life felt like it was moving through fog. No obvious wrong decision, just intersections that weren't bright enough yet to name. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a background sound like distant waves. Ava stood and pulled the curtain open slightly. Outside, the city blurred under the night lights. Streets weren't clearly visible, just patches of light melting into each other. She thought about the questions that had followed her for months. How much longer will I stay in this job? What do I want when my schedule isn't full anymore? If I stop, where would I go? The questions weren't urgent, but they lingered. Like fog, not blocking the road, just softening the view. Ava let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the bed. She turned on the bedside lamp, creating a small circle of light. Inside that circle, things were clear. Outside of it, nothing needed to be seen. She picked up the glass on the table and poured water from the pitcher. The sound of the water was gentle and steady. She took a small sip, then set the glass down. No rush, no schedule she had to follow right now. There was an image that had come to her many times, a small boat drifting through thick fog. The person steering couldn't see the far shore, couldn't see the whole river. Only a few feet of water ahead of the bow. And strangely, the boat could still move forward. Not fast, not with total certainty, but enough to avoid running aground. Ava realized she had been trying to see farther than she needed to. She wanted the entire path visible before allowing herself to move. But fog doesn't work that way. It doesn't lift because you strain your eyes. It thins only as you move forward a little at a time. She lay back on the bed without pulling the blanket up yet. Just lay there, letting the mattress support her back. The air conditioner continued its steady rhythm, a background breath she didn't need to control. The quiet was wide enough for her thoughts to slow. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The bedside lamp looked the same. No new information, no clear answers appearing. But there was no danger in front of her either. Just the night, the room, and a body that needed rest. She thought about flights that take off in fog. Pilots don't wait for the sky to become completely clear. They rely on the nearest instruments, the signals right in front of the aircraft. and once the plane rises, the fog stays below. Ava pulled the blanket up and placed a hand on her belly. Her breath rose and fell. Not deeper, not slower, just steady. She realized she didn't need to decide anything tonight. No need to map out the next year, just stay with the short stretch of path she could see. Outside, the city kept moving in the fog. Inside, the hotel room held its own quiet rhythm. Ava let her eyelids grow heavy, not because everything was clear, but because it didn't need to be any clearer right now. Maybe moving through fog isn't being lost. Maybe it's just the road asking us to slow down. The night in the hotel room moved more slowly than Ava expected, not because time had stretched, but because there was nothing left pushing her to keep up. The light from the bedside lamp softened in her vision as her eyelids grew heavier. The air conditioner continued its steady hum, an unchanging background sound, like a breath the room was holding for her. Ava rolled onto her side. The pillow supported her neck in a familiar way. She didn't try to find the perfect position. She simply lay in a way that asked nothing more from her body. In that just right darkness, thoughts still drifted by, but they no longer crowded the front of her mind. They stayed farther back, blurrier, like the city lights outside softened by fog. She thought again of the boat in the fog. Not a large boat, not a long journey, just a small one moving slowly, steady enough not to tip. The person steering didn't need a detailed map, didn't need to see the far shore, only needed to know which direction the bow was facing and that the water ahead was still deep enough to move through. Ava realized how often she exhausted herself by trying to see farther than the night allowed. During the day, that kind of looking ahead could be useful. But at night, seeing too far often turned into worry. It pulled the future closer than it needed to be, making things that hadn't arrived yet feel as heavy as if they already had. She took in a very gentle breath, then let it out. Not to calm anything, just letting her breath find its own rhythm. There are movements in the body that don't need willpower. When left alone, they know how to return to balance. Outside the window, the city was still there, even if Ava couldn't see it clearly. The roads were still open. The intersections still existed. Not seeing them right now didn't erase them. It simply meant they weren't needed in this moment. Ava remembered the feeling of sitting in the cockpit as a plane prepared to take off in fog. Not everything appeared at once, only the nearest signals, a runway, a few instruments, and the trust that as the plane moved forward, visibility would open up at the right time. She rested a hand on the blanket and felt its familiar warmth. Her hand relaxed, fingers loose. No need to hold on to any decision. Just knowing she was here safe in this room, in this moment. There are phases in life that don't ask us to know where we're going. They only ask us to keep moving slowly enough not to panic. And some nights, continuing simply means allowing ourselves to rest. Ava stopped trying to arrange the future in her mind. She didn't ask what would come next. She didn't force herself to feel calm. She let the night do its work, softening what didn't need to be seen yet, so the rest could rest. Her breathing became more even, not deep, not shallow, just even. With each exhale, her body felt a little heavier, as if being set down piece by piece. If the fog remained tomorrow, she would meet tomorrow then. If the road still wasn't clear, she would follow what she could see. No rush, no need for perfect certainty. Just enough. In the quiet hotel room, Ava let her eyes close fully. The bedside lamp was now only a faint glow behind her eyelids. There was nothing to complete before sleep. Nothing to decide. The boat continued to drift. No need to see the distant shore, only the water ahead still carrying it forward, and the night with all its softness and blur was doing that very well. Some things, when we hold on to them for too long, slowly dry us out. Not because they're too heavy, but because we repeat them day after day until they become the only thing we remember. Meanwhile, the good things, if we don't hold them carefully, slip away quickly as light as footprints in the sand. Grace was 62, a librarian for many years before retiring. She was used to quiet, to slow movements, and to observing more than speaking. That morning she went to the beach earlier than usual. The air was still misty, the shoreline long and nearly empty. The waves rolled in steadily, neither strong nor hurried. Grace slipped off her shoes and carried them in her hand, letting her bare feet sink into the cool sand. Each step left a clear mark behind her. She didn't look back right away. She simply felt her walking rhythm blend with the rhythm of the waves. There was a special kind of softness in the early morning, when nothing had yet taken on the stories of the day. She stopped near the water's edge, bent down, and used her finger to write a word in the sand. Not a name, not a full sentence. Just a familiar word, one tied to a memory she had carried for many years. When she finished, she stood up and stepped back. A wave came in. Not fast, not strong, but enough to reach the word. Its edges blurred. Then another wave arrived, and the word nearly disappeared. Grace watched without a sense of loss. Only a small feeling of relief, like exhaling after holding your breath longer than you realized. She thought back to the early days after losing her partner. The pain then was sharp, unmistakable. Over time, though, it changed shape. It no longer knocked her down, but stayed as a line written over and over inside her. Each time she remembered, she rewrote it again without noticing. Grace didn't blame herself for that. Everyone has things that are hard to let go of. But standing here with the sea in front of her, she suddenly saw something clearly. Maybe not everything needs to be carved deeply to prove it once mattered. She continued walking along the beach. A little farther on, a large rock rose up, its surface smoothed by wind and water. Grace stopped and placed her hand on it. The stone was cool and solid, unmoving. She didn't write on it. She just rested her hand there, feeling its steady presence. Another image appeared in her mind, not of loss, but of an afternoon many years ago, when someone had held her hand tightly at a moment she needed it most. Such a small gesture, yet it had stayed with her for so long. It didn't need to be repeated to remain. It never faded. Grace felt the contrast clearly. Some things are meant to be carried away by the tide, and some are meant to be kept, not by repeating them, but by carving them into something strong enough to hold them. She sat down on the rock, and watched the sea grow brighter. The waves continued to erase her footprints in the sand. No mark lasted long, but the beach didn't lose its shape because of that. It remained whole in its own way. Grace breathed in then out slowly. Not as a ritual, just a breath that matched the morning. She didn't need to decide anything right now. She only needed to see that she didn't have to carry every pain like a rare possession. Some things are allowed to fade. She stood up, slipped her shoes back on, and walked slowly toward the path. Behind her, the sand smoothed itself out, no trace of the word left behind. But the rock was still there, and the feeling of that long-ago handhold was too. Grace left the beach once the sun had risen high enough for the thin mist to fade. The small road leading home was still quiet houses closed up, as if the whole neighborhood was lingering in sleep a little longer. She walked slowly, not from tiredness, but because there was no need to rush. When she reached home, Grace placed her shoes by the door and rinsed her feet under cool water. The sand washed away quickly, leaving no trace behind. She dried her feet and stood still for a moment, feeling the cool floor beneath her. Small sensations like that, when noticed, often help the mind stop circling back to old loops. In the living room, morning light slipped through the curtains, stretching long bands across the wooden floor. Grace sat down in her familiar chair by the window. A few old photographs rested neatly on the table. She didn't pick them up. She didn't need to. Those images had been held long enough. She thought about the difference between remembering and clinging. Remembering allows something to have a quiet place in the heart. Clinging drags it everywhere, never letting it rest. She realized that for many years she had been doing both at once, and it had tired her more than necessary. Grace stood up and opened the window. Morning air flowed in, carrying a faint saltiness from the sea. The breeze stirred the curtains gently. Nothing was disturbed. It was just the soft movement of a new day beginning. She returned to her chair and closed her eyes for a short while. Not to stop her thoughts completely, just to let them pass without sticking. Old images drifted by, then moved on. No need to hold. No need to push away. Grace noticed that the good things in her life had never needed constant repetition to stay real. They were there, solid as stone, even without being named. And the painful things, when allowed to be carried off by the wind, no longer felt as sharp as before. The morning passed slowly. Grace made a cup of tea and set it on the table, watching the steam rise and disappear. She took a small sip, feeling the warmth spread. Nothing remarkable, but enough. As afternoon arrived, the light shifted. Grace didn't return to the beach. She didn't need to. The morning moment was enough to stay with her through the day. It didn't need to be repeated to prove it was real. That evening, Grace prepared to sleep early. She turned off most of the lights, leaving the familiar dim glow. When she lay down, she didn't think about the words she had written in the sand. They were gone. She didn't cling tightly to the good things either. They were already there. Her breathing was steady and light. There was no sense of lack. Nothing that needed to be resolved before sleep. Just a clear distinction between what needed to be let go and what was allowed to remain. If old memories return tomorrow, Grace knows she can write them in the sand again. Not to avoid them, but to give them a way out. And if something kind appears, she knows she can carve it a little deeper without fear of losing it. The room settled into quiet. No conclusions, no reminders. Just someone who had learned where to write and a body finally allowed to rest. And in that stillness, sleep arrived naturally, like waves finishing their work on the sand, while the stone remained quietly in place. There are days when you do so many things, yet by evening you feel completely empty. Not because you're lazy, not because you didn't try. It's just that your energy has been quietly leaking away, little by little all day long without you noticing. Like a bucket with a small hole in the bottom. You keep pouring water in, but it never quite fills. Rachel is 39 years old. She works in office administration and is a single mother to an 8-year-old boy. Her days start early and late, and in between are countless small tasks stacked back to back. That evening, after her son has fallen asleep, Rachel stands in the laundry room folding clothes fresh out of the dryer. The machine makes a steady thump, thump, sound a familiar background rhythm of the night. She folds each shirt and places it neatly into a pile. The motions are automatic, no thinking required. But her mind refuses to rest. Remember to sign the school form tomorrow. I still haven't replied to that email. I wonder if there'll be enough money this month. Small worries. Each one on its own isn't enough to be called a crisis. But together, they're enough to make her feel more exhausted than she did during the busiest part of the day. Rachel sets down the last shirt. The stack of laundry is neat and finished. And yet, she doesn't feel done. She feels drained. She leans back against the washing machine and closes her eyes for a moment. The dryer keeps running steady and unhurried, not stopping just because she's tired. A familiar thought appears. Maybe I'm just weak. Rachel doesn't like this thought, but it arrives easily. As if whenever she feels worn out, her mind automatically searches for an explanation, and the most familiar one is blaming herself. She opens her eyes and looks at the folded clothes. They aren't the problem. Today wasn't exactly bad either, and yet her energy is gone. Not because she did something wrong, but because all day long she's been letting worry leak out without realizing it. Worry isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a stream of small questions that keep showing up. What if something goes wrong? Each question is like a tiny hole. It doesn't cause an immediate spill, but over time, the bucket empties. Rachel picks up a towel and dries her hands. Her movements are slow. She notices her shoulders are lifted, as if she's carrying an invisible load. She lets them drop, not forcing it, just releasing. And when her shoulders lower, the tension in her neck eases too. A very small change, but enough to remind her how much she's been holding inside. She thinks back to the morning. When her son asked a simple question, she'd answered a little sharply. Not because he did anything wrong, just because her bucket was already nearly empty. And when the bucket is low, even small reactions spill out easily. Rachel doesn't blame herself. At least not tonight. Instead, she sees the connection clearly. The more she worries, the more her energy leaks away. Not because worrying is bad, but because worrying without pause uses up a lot of water. She turns off the dryer. The laundry room grows suddenly quiet. In that quiet, Rachel can hear her own breathing more clearly. Not rushed, not perfectly even, but real, no longer crowded out by a mental to-do list. She carries the folded clothes into the bedroom and sets them on the bed. She doesn't fold anything else. This is enough. The rest can wait until tomorrow. Not out of laziness, but because her bucket needs to hold on to a little water for her too. If you're listening to this and often feel tired without knowing why, that's okay. You might not be lacking energy at all. You might simply be letting it slip away through small worries you haven't had a chance to notice yet. And tonight, you don't need to pour in more water. You only need to gently look at where it's been leaking. Rachel carries the folded laundry into the bedroom and sets it neatly on a chair, then turns off the light in the laundry room. The light behind her disappears. The hallway grows a little darker, a little quieter. She walks slowly, as if her body already knows there's nothing left that needs to be rushed. In the kitchen, Rachel pours herself a glass of water. Not full, just halfway. She leans against the counter and takes small sips. The water is cool and simple, nothing symbolic at first glance. And then very clearly she realizes this: if a cup has a hole in it, filling it all the way doesn't help. What matters isn't adding more water, but stopping it from leaking out. She sets the glass down and looks around the familiar kitchen. Everything is where it should be. Nothing needs fixing right now. Nothing is about to fall apart. There are many unfinished things, but none of them need her attention in this moment. A thought appears: I need to remember tomorrow. Rachel pauses. She doesn't push the thought away. She simply says gently in her mind, tomorrow morning. Not a promise, just permission. She walks into the living room and sits on the sofa. The backrest supports her. Her feet rest on the floor. Her hands rest on her thighs. She doesn't pick up her phone. She doesn't turn on the TV. She isn't trying to relax. She's just allowing herself to stop spending any more energy. Some leaks are very small. They don't come from big crises. They come from always thinking one step ahead, always worrying one more round, always asking what if, even when nothing is happening. Those questions aren't wrong. But without a stopping point, they can drain us before the day is truly over. Rachel closes her eyes, not to fall asleep right away, just to stop looking for a while. Her exhale lengthens slightly. Her shoulders soften. Her stomach no longer feels as tight as it did earlier. Her body is quietly holding on to the water that remains. She thinks about her son, about the morning. A gentle worry appears, but this time it doesn't pull a long chain of thoughts behind it. It arrives and stays right there. It doesn't spread. It doesn't drill another hole. Rachel stands and walks into the bedroom. She doesn't refold the laundry. She doesn't organize anything else. She changes into her sleep clothes, pulls up the blanket, and lies down. The bed supports her body, just like the sofa did earlier, asking nothing more. Some nights, the kindest thing we can do for ourselves isn't to find a solution, but to stop draining ourselves further. To stop blaming ourselves. To stop pushing our minds to keep going. To stop letting small worries take the last bit of energy we have. If you're listening to this and recognize this kind of tiredness, that's okay. You don't have to patch every hole in one night. You just don't need to make any new ones. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be full. You only need to save a little for yourself. If you fall asleep at some point, that's completely natural. If you're still awake, you're safe in this pause. Tonight, you don't need to carry the whole world in your bucket. You can let it rest, and rest yourself too. The hotel room was quiet in the particular way only hotel rooms are. Not truly silent, but padded. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a low, even sound that felt like it was holding the room together. Ava lay on the bed with one arm draped over her stomach, the other resting along her side, still in her work clothes shoes, kicked off near the door where they had landed. She had arrived less than an hour ago, but the sense of dislocation had already settled in. Different city, same carpet, same heavy curtains, same faint smell of detergent and recycled air. Ava had learned to recognize that feeling early in her career, the sense of being everywhere and nowhere at once. She was 29 and worked as a flight attendant. From the outside, it sounded glamorous. Travel, movement, a life that didn't sit still long enough to get boring. People often said they were jealous. Ava smiled when they did. It was easier than explaining the parts that didn't show up in photos. Tonight's flight had been smooth. Short conversations, polite passengers, nothing memorable. And yet, as soon as she closed the hotel door behind her, the quiet had pressed in heavier than expected. Ava rolled onto her side and stared at the thin strip of light leaking around the curtain. Somewhere beyond it, a city she barely knew was going about its evening. People meeting friends, people going home, people sleeping in beds that didn't change every few nights. She reached for the remote and turned the TV on, then off again almost immediately. The voices felt too close, too awake. She preferred the steady sound of the air conditioner, constant and indifferent. Ava pushed herself up and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on her thighs. She bent forward slightly, letting her head hang for a moment long enough to feel the blood shift, long enough for the day to slide out of focus. She'd been good at moving for as long as she could remember. Good at adapting, good at smiling, and being pleasant in short bursts. But nights like this always brought the same question quietly, without accusation. Where do I actually belong? Not in a dramatic way. She wasn't lonely exactly. She had friends. She had a job she liked well enough. But sometimes, especially in hotel rooms that all looked the same, she felt like a small point of light drifting between places, never landing long enough to be named. Ava stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out. The city below was a scatter of lights, uneven and distant. Cars moved along dark lines of road. A few buildings glowed brighter than others. No single light stood out for long. She leaned her forehead lightly against the glass and exhaled. Earlier that day, during a layover, she'd overheard a passenger talking about stars. About how some were so far away that the light reaching us now had started its journey millions of years ago. Some of those stars don't even exist anymore, the passenger had said casually. But we still see them. That idea had stayed with her. Ava looked at the lights below and thought about how often she felt small in comparison to everything else. How easy it was to believe that if she wasn't central, she must be insignificant. That if no one was looking directly at her, she might as well not be there at all. She pulled the curtain back into place and returned to the bed, sitting cross-legged, now hands resting loosely in her lap. The air conditioner clicked softly as it adjusted, then returned to its steady hum. Ava closed her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to pause. She noticed how her body felt when it wasn't bracing for the next announcement, the next boarding call, the next smile. There was a faint ache in her shoulders, a tiredness behind her eyes, and beneath that, something gentler, a quiet persistence. She thought about stars again, about how many of them we never notice. Not because they aren't shining, but because the sky is vast and our attention is limited. A star doesn't stop being a star just because it isn't named or pointed at. That thought didn't make her feel special. It made her feel allowed to be small without being meaningless, allowed to be quiet without disappearing. Ava lay back and stared at the ceiling. The room felt less foreign now, its edges softening as her breathing slowed. The air conditioner continued its steady work, filling the space with something predictable. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to anchor herself to one place to be real. She could exist exactly as she was moving, passing through, leaving small traces of light behind her without tracking where they landed. Some stars don't guide ships. Some don't carry names. They still shine. Ava felt her eyelids grow heavy as that idea settled in her body. Not as a belief to hold on to, but as a quiet truth she didn't need to defend. The room held her gently anonymous and safe as the night deepened around the window. Ava lay still as the room continued its quiet work around her. The air conditioner hummed without change, steady and unconcerned. Outside, the city lights shifted slightly as clouds moved through the sky, softening some points of brightness while allowing others to come through more clearly. She rested one hand on her stomach and felt the gentle rise and fall of her breath. Each inhale arrived on its own. Each exhale left without being held. Her body knew how to do this part without instruction. For a long time, Ava had believed that being visible meant being valuable. That if her presence didn't register strongly, if it didn't leave an impression, it must not have mattered. That belief had followed her from place to place, quietly shaping how she saw herself during layovers, conversations, even moments of rest. But stars don't measure their worth by how many eyes find them. They don't dim themselves when no one is looking. They don't rush to become brighter than the sky around them. The thought settled in her slowly, like light spreading after dusk. Ava didn't feel grand or important. She felt relieved, as if she had been released from a task she didn't remember agreeing to. She shifted slightly, pulling the blanket up and letting the weight of it ground her. The bed held her without preference. The room didn't ask for her story. It didn't need her to be interesting. Ava thought about the places she'd passed through over the years. Airports that blurred together. Hotel rooms she could barely distinguish from one another. Faces she remembered without names. All those moments had felt temporary, almost disposable, as if they didn't count because they didn't last. But nothing about a star's light is wasted. Even the faintest glow travels far beyond its origin, touching things it will never see. That idea softened something deep in her chest. Maybe her life didn't need a single fixed center to be meaningful. Maybe meaning could move with her, appearing wherever she was willing to be present, even briefly. She closed her eyes and let the darkness behind her eyelids deepen. The city outside continued without her participation. Cars moved, elevators rose and fell. Somewhere a door opened and closed. The room stayed steady. Ava noticed how much quieter her mind had become. The questions about belonging didn't feel urgent anymore. They could wait. They always could. She remembered standing at windows like this before in other cities, other nights, feeling the same smallness and mistaking it for emptiness. Tonight, that smallness felt different. It felt like space, not empty, open. The air conditioner clicked once, then resumed its hum. Ava's breathing matched it naturally, slow and even. The edges of her thoughts blurred, one dissolving into the next without resistance. She didn't need to shine in a particular way. She didn't need to be central. She didn't need to leave a mark she could track. Being here was enough. Shining quietly was enough. Some stars are seen, some are not. The sky makes room for all of them. Ava drifted toward sleep with that understanding resting gently in her body. The hotel room holding her like a temporary sky, neutral, quiet, and complete. The beach in the late afternoon moved at a different pace. No more loud laughter, no rush from the harsh sun. Just the steady rhythm of the waves and a light breeze carrying the smell of salt. Jason crouched near the water's edge, his hands coated in wet sand. In front of him, a sandcastle was slowly taking shape. Jason was 23, a community college student who had just finished a not-so-great semester. His grades weren't bad enough to panic over, but not good enough to feel settled either. Some nights, he lay awake thinking about the future, the way you think about a math problem with missing information. No matter how hard you try, something always feels incomplete. That afternoon, he came to the beach alone. Not to figure anything out, just to sit somewhere that didn't ask things to last. He scooped up sand, packed it down, stacked small sections one on top of another. The castle wasn't big. It had no ambition, just enough to let him see his effort turn into something visible. Each time a wave pulled back, the wet sand shimmered, reflecting the fading sky. Jason built low walls, smoothing them gently with his fingers. There was a natural focus in those repeated movements. No plan, no optimization, just being there. He thought about the plans he'd made before. Other castles, school goals, career paths, images of a clearer future. Some of them he'd built carefully, piece by piece. And then for one reason or another, they hadn't held the way he'd hoped. They didn't collapse all at once. They just softened, touched by the waves of circumstance. Jason added a small tower to one corner of the castle. It leaned slightly. He adjusted it gently, not trying to make it perfectly straight, just enough for it to stand. Wet sand holds its shape pretty well for a while. The water crept closer. A thin sheet of it brushed the base of the castle, then pulled away. It didn't destroy anything. It just left behind small grooves. Jason watched without lifting the castle higher. He knew the tide was rising on its own schedule. Something became very clear to him in that moment. Building isn't meaningless even when the result doesn't last. The feel of sand in his hands, the focus of placing each piece, the moment of seeing something he made stand even temporarily. All of it was real. Jason leaned back a little, giving the waves more room. He planted his hands behind him, feeling the cool sand under his palms. The air was softer. The sun was lower. No one was rushing him to finish before dark. A familiar fear crossed his mind. If everything I build can be washed away, what's the point of building at all? But the question felt lighter as he looked at the castle. The castle didn't ask to last forever. It only asked to be built with full presence. Jason leaned in again and fixed a small detail near the entrance. Not to make it stronger, just because he felt like it. A very small pleasure with no long-term payoff. No need for recognition. The waves returned, this time a little stronger. One corner wall collapsed slowly. No drama. The sand loosened and dissolved into the water. Jason didn't reach out to save it. He just watched. His chest didn't tighten the way he expected. There was a brief sense of loss. Then it passed. Sometimes we think we're afraid of losing things, when what we're really afraid of is the act of holding on. When the grip loosens, that fear has nowhere to stand. Jason stood up and brushed the sand from his pants. He looked at the castle once more. It was still there, even with a corner gone. Enough to see that care had gone into it. Enough to know he had built it honestly. The sky shifted colors. The breeze grew cooler. Jason turned away from the castle and walked along the shoreline. He didn't need to stay for the final moment. He didn't need to make sure of anything. He knew the waves would do their work, and somehow, that knowledge made his steps feel lighter. Jason walked slowly along the shoreline, leaving faint footprints in the wet sand behind him. With each step, the prints stayed visible for a few seconds. Then the waves washed over them, unhurried, not erasing them all at once. He didn't turn around to look. Not because he wanted to forget, but because there was no need to check. The wind softened. The air was cool, carrying the familiar scent of salt and seaweed. Jason let out a long breath, as if his body were gently setting something down. Something it had been holding all day. Not a decision, just the feeling of having to hold on. He sat on a low rock near the water. Waves hit the stone, then pulled back steady and predictable. No two waves were the same, but the rhythm was familiar. Jason rested his hands on his knees, feeling the chill of the wind first, then the warmth returning as his body adjusted. He thought about the sandcastle, not its shape, but the feeling of building it. The weight of wet sand in his hands. The quiet focus of placing each small piece where it belonged. That feeling hadn't been taken by the waves. It was still there, close and intact. Maybe not everything we do needs to stay. Maybe some things only need to pass through our hands, leave a mark inside us, and then be allowed to dissolve. Like waves, like footprints, like plans that were once taken very seriously, but no longer fit who we are now. Jason lifted his gaze to the horizon. The sun hovered just above the water, its light stretched into a thin golden line. Not dramatic, not loud, just there. He didn't take a photo. He didn't try to capture the moment. Some moments are most beautiful when they don't need proof. He noticed he was no longer blaming himself for the castles that had been lost. Not because he'd figured everything out, but because he no longer saw loss as failure. It was simply part of building in a world that's always moving. The waves kept rising and falling. Somewhere behind him, the sandcastle might have collapsed further or disappeared completely. Jason didn't know. And strangely, not knowing didn't bother him. It created a light open space where he didn't have to keep watch. He stood up and brushed the sand from his hands. The sun sank a little lower. The sky deepened into blue. Jason walked toward the parking lot, not fast, not slow. His steps were steady. There was nothing he needed to rush to hold on to before night arrived. On the way back, he thought about the things he still wanted to do. Not big plans, just small things he could start then adjust as he went. Like building another sandcastle someday on a different beach. Not to make it last forever, but to build it again. Sometimes we think letting go means giving up. But maybe letting go is simply allowing ourselves not to carry what has already finished its work. Those things don't disappear. They become sand. They become ground. They become what supports the next steps. Jason stopped and looked at the ocean one last time before leaving. The waves were steady, the breeze cool, nothing especially remarkable. And because of that, the moment was calm enough to set down. He turned away and walked on. Not carrying the castle, only the feeling of having built with care and having let go at the right time. The night took care of the rest. Some doors don't need to be locked from the outside. They close very softly, almost without a sound. And then we get so used to being inside that we forget we ever had the key. Ben was 31, working in startups, living alone in an apartment that was darker than it needed to be. Not because he liked the dark, but because bright light made his thoughts feel louder. That evening, he sat on the sofa with only a small lamp turned on near the wall. The warm yellow light reached the ceiling enough to give the room shape, but not enough to demand his attention. Ben's phone rested in his hand. The screen lit up, then went dark. Lit up, then dark again. Old notifications. Messages he hadn't replied to. Emails he had read but never reopened. He didn't act on any of them. He just held the phone like holding a thread that connected him to a place he didn't want to return to. There was someone Ben hadn't forgiven. Not because that person hadn't apologized. The apology had come long ago. Short, clear, no excuses. But inside Ben, the door stayed closed. Not to punish anyone, only because he was afraid that if he opened it, everything would rush in at once. He had thought about it many times. About keeping distance. about protecting himself. And in a way, he had succeeded too well. So well that there was no one else left in that space with him. Ben set the phone down on the table, then picked it up again. He had done this for many evenings in a row, as if holding it meant he was still in control of the story. But every time the screen went dark, the room felt larger and the silence more noticeable. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city was still moving. Car lights stretched into long lines. No one knew he was standing there. No one was waiting for him to respond. The thought felt both relieving and sad. Ben remembered the first time he decided to close the door. There was no ritual, no announcement, just an evening much like this one, when he felt too tired to keep explaining, too tired to keep hoping. And so he closed it slowly, firmly. At first it felt like safety, like being in a room where no one could interrupt. But over time, the room stayed the same while he changed. The air grew heavier. The distance between him and the world stretched longer. Ben returned to the sofa and sat down. He unlocked the phone, looked at the screen, then locked it again. A small click echoed in the quiet. The sound made him pause, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. Familiar enough that he'd never really noticed it before. He tried something very small. He didn't open an app. He didn't read a message. He simply placed the phone face down on the table, so the screen could no longer look at him. A sense of emptiness appeared right away, like closing a side door and suddenly realizing how quiet the main room is. Ben rested his hands on his thighs. His shoulders were tight. He let them drop slightly, not to relax, just because they were tired. In that moment, he noticed something that surprised him. This door might never have been locked from the outside at all. No one was standing guard. No one was holding the key. There was only him sitting here, used to staying inside. The thought didn't make him jump up and open the door right away. It simply created a small opening, just enough to let the space feel less suffocating. Ben leaned back into the sofa. The yellow light was the same. The room was the same. But the feeling of being trapped wasn't as solid as before. It shifted into a quiet question: if I open the door, what's the worst that could happen? He didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. Tonight wasn't the time to decide. It was enough to know that the door wasn't a wall, and that the thickest walls are sometimes built from habit alone. Ben closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to stop seeing the door. When he opened them again, the room hadn't changed. But the tightness in his chest had eased just a little. And that alone was enough to make this evening feel less like a sealed prison than it had before. Ben stayed seated on the sofa a little longer. There was no urge to do anything next. Without the phone clenched in his hand, his palms rested empty on his thighs, but the emptiness wasn't as uncomfortable as he'd imagined. It felt like taking off a heavy jacket and realizing the room temperature is just right. He stood and walked into the kitchen. He didn't turn on the overhead light, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. Ben poured himself a glass of water and took small sips. The coolness slid down his throat, waking his body slightly, but in a gentle way. He didn't need more caffeine. Tonight he didn't need to stay alert guarding anything. When he returned to the living room, Ben noticed the door to the balcony. It was closed but not locked. He looked at the handle for a moment. He didn't step closer. He didn't try to open it. He just looked. And for the first time in months, the thought "I'm stuck" didn't arrive with that image. He remembered the early days after the inner door had closed. Back then he believed he was protecting a wound. And maybe he was. But over time, the wound had changed. It no longer needed the same level of guarding. He just hadn't updated the way he was living with it. Ben went back to the sofa and sat down again. His back settled into the cushion legs stretched out. This wasn't a defensive posture. It was the posture of someone resting. His breath moved in and out steady. No counting, no adjusting. Nothing here was threatening him. He thought of the other person briefly. No clear image, no specific words, just a faint presence. He realized he didn't need to decide about forgiveness right now. He only needed to stop imprisoning himself inside an undecided moment. Some doors don't need to be thrown wide open for us to feel freer. It's enough to know they can open. Enough to stop leaning our weight against them all day long. Ben stood and pulled the curtain back a little. The city outside was still lit. No one noticed whether he opened the curtain or not. A light breeze slipped through the gap, bringing in cool air, a small exchange between inside and out. He went to bed. He didn't bring the phone with him. He didn't bring the old story either. When he lay down, his body responded quickly. The blanket rested over his shoulders. The temperature was just right. Nothing else needed arranging. Ben closed his eyes. He wasn't trying to sleep. He let his eyelids grow heavy with the rhythm of his breath. The door in his mind wasn't fully open, but it wasn't sealed shut anymore. Light wasn't flooding in, but air was moving. If tomorrow he still isn't ready to step outside, that's okay. No one is counting the days he spends in or out. There's no sentence waiting. Some processes don't need speed. They just need the lock to be gone. The room was quiet. No sound of bolts, no click of locks. Just a man who was no longer holding himself as tightly as before, and a body allowed to rest in a space that finally felt wide enough. And in that gentle loosening sleep arrived, without needing to pass through any door at all. There are moments when you've already gotten on the ride, already taken your seat, and yet your body still refuses to rest. Not because the ride is rough, not because the road is difficult. It's just that you're still carrying your baggage on your shoulders even though you don't need to anymore. And by evening, the tiredness doesn't come from the distance traveled, but from not letting yourself set the load down. Marcus is 41 years old. He works as a delivery driver. His whole day is a series of trips, stop deliver sign, get back in the vehicle, repeat. When his shift ends, he drives back to the parking lot behind the warehouse, turns off the engine but stays seated in the driver's seat. The motor is quiet now. His body isn't. He keeps both hands on the steering wheel longer than necessary. Not gripping it, just resting them there. As if letting go might cause something to slip away. Outside the lot, slowly empties. A few cars pull out red taillights, stretching into lines before disappearing. Marcus stays where he is, shoulders slightly raised, his back not fully aware of the seat behind him. Nothing major went wrong today. No serious delays, no complaints. And yet, in his mind, there's a long list of things he could have done better. Delivered a little earlier, spoken a little more smoothly to a customer, driven a little faster on that one stretch of road. Each thought isn't heavy on its own, but together they're enough to keep his shoulders from dropping. Marcus opens the door and steps out of the vehicle. The evening air is cooler, carrying the scent of asphalt and a light breeze. He stretches his arms, rolls his neck a few times. On his back is the familiar backpack. Not very heavy, but after carrying it all day, the strain is clearly etched into his shoulders. He takes the backpack off and places it on the passenger seat. A small movement, but as the straps leave his shoulders, Marcus exhales more deeply than usual, as if his body had been waiting for that exact moment. He stands beside the vehicle, leaning lightly against the door, looking out over the quiet parking lot. Some people are used to carrying everything themselves. So used to it that even when they don't have to, they still do. Like wearing a backpack while already sitting on the bus. Not because they don't trust the ride, but because they've grown accustomed to being responsible for every bit of movement. Marcus remembers riding the bus as a child, gripping his backpack tightly, afraid of dropping it, forgetting it, losing it. As he grew older, that habit didn't disappear. It just changed shape. The backpack stopped being books and notebooks and became responsibility, worry, and the feeling that he always had to be ready. He opens the car door and sits back down in the driver's seat. This time his back rests fully against it. The seat supports his weight, something he rarely notices during the day. Marcus places his hands on his thighs. He's no longer holding the steering wheel. He doesn't need to hold anything. A familiar thought appears. What if something happens? He notices it and lets it stay. No answer, no argument. He looks at it the way you look at an old roadside sign. You know it's there, but you don't need to stop for it. Marcus closes his eyes for a few seconds. Not to sleep, just to feel the seat holding him. The engine is off. Nothing is moving. And in that stillness, he realizes something very simple. There are parts of the journey you don't need to walk yourself. You just need to sit still and let the vehicle do its job. He opens his eyes, takes the backpack from the passenger seat and places it on the floor of the car. Not on his shoulders anymore. Not because he won't need it tomorrow, just because right now it isn't necessary. The parking lot remains quiet. Nothing falls apart when he sets it down. If you're listening to this and feel tired even though you're done for the day, that's okay. Maybe you've already gotten on the ride, but you're still wearing the backpack, and tonight you don't need to prove that you can carry more. You're already on the ride. It's already carrying you. You can let your shoulders rest. Marcus stays in the car a little longer. No music, no phone. Just sitting there with the windows closed, the quiet parking lot, and the yellow lights spread evenly across the pavement. The backpack rests on the floor of the car, no longer touching his shoulders. The brief sense of emptiness passes quickly, replaced by a lightness he didn't expect. He leans further back into the seat. The car supports his full weight, his back, his hips, his shoulders. When he doesn't have to hold himself up, his body naturally finds a more comfortable position. A long exhale leaves him, not forced, just happening. Some days we believe that if we stop carrying everything, things will fall apart. But tonight, as Marcus sits still in a car with the engine off, he sees the opposite. Everything is still there. Still okay. Even when he isn't carrying it on his shoulders. He opens the car door and steps outside. No rush. The backpack stays inside. He locks the door and stands there for a moment looking around. A light breeze moves through. Distant insects hum. There's no sound asking him to react. No task waiting for him. Marcus walks toward his own car parked in another part of the lot. The path is short and familiar. When he gets in, he doesn't put the backpack on again. He places it on the back seat instead. A small decision, but his shoulders feel lighter immediately. The car rolls forward. Streetlights pass one by one, steady and calm. Marcus drives a little slower than usual. Not because he's tired, just because there's no need to hurry. In the rearview mirror, the cars behind him aren't pressing. The road is wide enough for him to move at his own pace. A thought shows up. Should I squeeze in one more task? Marcus notices it and lets it drift past. Right now, the car is doing its job, and his only job is to sit there, hold the wheel gently, and allow himself to be carried. When he gets home, Marcus parks by the entrance. He turns off the engine and stays still for a few seconds. Inside the house, the lights are off. No one is waiting for an explanation. No one needs him to keep trying. He opens the door, steps inside, and leaves the backpack near the entrance, not carrying it deeper into the house. In the living room, Marcus sits down on the couch. The backrest supports him just like the car seat did earlier. His body seems to remember how to be held again without bracing, without tightening. If you're listening to this and recognize how used you are to carrying everything yourself, that's okay. Many people grow up believing that holding it all together is what keeps them safe. But tonight, you can try something different. Let the ride carry you a little farther. You don't have to put everything down. Just the things you don't need to carry into sleep. Marcus stands and walks into the bedroom. He changes clothes, turns off the light, and lies down. When his head meets the pillow, his shoulders are no longer as tight as they were earlier in the car. His body remembers how to rest. If you fall asleep at some point while listening, that's completely okay. If you're still awake, you're still moving in a very safe rhythm. Tonight, you're already on the ride. It's already carrying you. You can leave the backpack behind and let your shoulders rest for a while. Carla noticed the crack while she was washing dishes. It wasn't new. That was the strange part. The small ceramic bowl had been chipped for a long time, a thin line running from the rim down one side, like a quiet scar. She had used it dozens of times without really seeing it. Tonight, under the warm kitchen light, it caught her attention. She slowed her hands in the sink, letting the water run over the bowl. The crack darkened slightly as it filled, then lightened again as the water drained away. The sound of the faucet was steady, familiar, the kind of sound that made the rest of the house feel calmer. Carla was 48 and worked as a hairstylist. All day she stood behind people adjusting smoothing, making small corrections so others could leave feeling more put together than when they arrived. She was good at it. She had learned how to notice tiny details and fix them gently without drawing attention to the flaw. It rarely occurred to her to do the same for herself. She turned the bowl in her hands, studying the crack more closely now. It wasn't jagged. It didn't threaten to break apart. It simply existed, part of the bowl's shape, part of its history. Earlier that evening, a client had laughed and said, "You're so confident, I wish I was more like you." Carla had smiled and changed the subject the way she always did. Confidence felt like the wrong word. She felt capable, yes, reliable, but confident implied something unbroken, something smooth. Carla set the bowl in the drying rack and reached for a towel. As she dried her hands, her eyes drifted to the stack of mismatched dishes on the counter. None of them were perfect. Small chips, faded patterns, items collected over years rather than chosen all at once. She had always liked it that way. A kitchen that looked lived in. And yet, when it came to herself, she held a different standard. She noticed every crack, every place where she felt she should have healed faster, known better, been stronger by now. The faucet clicked off. The kitchen settled into a deeper quiet, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock above the fridge. Carla leaned her hip against the counter and let her shoulders relax forward. She thought about the word flawed, how easily it attached itself to people. How often she had described herself that way in her own head, as if a crack automatically meant something was damaged beyond use. Carla picked the bowl up again and held it at eye level. The light caught the glaze unevenly along the crack, creating a faint line of reflection. It wasn't ugly. If anything, it made the bowl more interesting, more honest. She remembered something she had read years ago about old pottery in Japan. How cracks were sometimes repaired with gold, not to hide the break, but to highlight it. The idea had stayed with her, even if she couldn't remember the name for it. The bowl in her hands hadn't been repaired with gold. No one had tried to make the crack beautiful. And still, it held water. It held food. It did exactly what it was meant to do. Carla felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the kind that came when she thought about her own past. Relationships that hadn't lasted. Choices she replayed late at night, the quiet belief that if she were less marked, life would have gone more smoothly. She set the bowl back down carefully and rested both palms on the counter. The surface was cool, solid, trustworthy. She took a slow breath and let it out without shaping it. What if being whole didn't mean being uncracked? What if it simply meant being able to hold what life placed inside you? The thought didn't demand an answer. It stayed there like the bowl on the counter, waiting to be noticed. Carla turned off the kitchen light and left the room dim, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. The crack in the bowl was harder to see now, but she knew it was still there. And for the first time that evening, that didn't feel like a problem. Carla left the kitchen and moved into the living room, not turning on any more lights. The house felt different in the dimness, softer, less demanding. Shadows settled into corners without being asked to explain themselves. She sat down on the couch and let her back sink into the cushions, arms resting where they fell. The image of the bowl stayed with her, not as a symbol she needed to analyze, but as a quiet presence, something ordinary that had done its job without pretending to be untouched. She thought about how often she had treated her own life as if it were supposed to look unused. No visible wear, no chips, no signs that anything had ever pressed too hard. And when the marks showed up anyway, she'd taken them as evidence of failure instead of evidence of living. Carla crossed her legs and leaned her head back against the couch. The fabric was worn smooth in places, shaped by years of use. She liked that about it. It held her without trying to impress her. She remembered moments she usually avoided thinking about. Times she had trusted too much, stayed too long, left too early. None of them felt sharp tonight. They felt distant, like old weather that had already passed through. The bowl hadn't cracked because it was weak. It had cracked because it had been used, held heat, held weight, been part of countless small moments that mattered enough to leave a trace. Carla felt something ease in her chest as that understanding settled. She didn't need to repair herself to be acceptable. She didn't need to hide the places where life had pressed in. Those places didn't cancel her usefulness. They explained it. She stood up and walked back into the kitchen, drawn there without urgency. The bowl sat quietly in the drying rack, a thin line visible along its side. Carla lifted it again, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. It was steady, reliable. She filled it with water and carried it carefully to the sink. The bowl held the water without leaking, without protest. The crack didn't compromise its purpose. It simply told a story. Carla set the bowl down and turned off the remaining light. The kitchen faded into shadow, leaving only the faint outline of shapes she knew well. She didn't need to see everything clearly to trust it. In the bedroom, she changed into something soft and loose movements, slow, unhurried. The mirror caught her reflection briefly. She didn't look away. She didn't search for flaws. She just saw a woman who had been shaped by years of showing up. Carla lay down and pulled the blanket over herself, letting the weight settle across her shoulders. Her breathing slowed naturally, without direction. The day began to loosen its hold. She thought again of the pottery repaired with gold, the way cracks were honored instead of hidden. Not because suffering was beautiful, but because survival was honest. Maybe wholeness wasn't about returning to an unmarked state. Maybe it was about holding everything past present memory without falling apart. Carla felt her thoughts grow quieter, edges blurring. The crack no longer felt like something that needed attention. It simply existed, integrated, complete in its own way. The house rested around her, familiar and imperfect. The night moved forward without expectation. Somewhere the bowl waited in the kitchen, ready to be used again tomorrow. Carla closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest, without fixing, without correcting, without pretending to be unbroken. Nothing needed to be repaired tonight. Nothing needed to be hidden. She drifted toward sleep whole, not because she was flawless, but because she was still here, still holding still enough. Winter doesn't always arrive with snow. Sometimes it comes as cold wind slipping through your collar, as gray skies that linger for days, as the quiet sense that everything has slowed down without any announcement. Holly stood at the bus stop, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. It was already dark earlier than in other seasons. Streetlights flickered on their pale yellow glow, reflecting off the damp pavement. The wind wasn't strong, but it was enough to let the cold creep into every small opening. Holly was 33, a nursing assistant used to taking care of others. Her shift had ended late, her body tired, her mind empty in that specific way that comes from giving too much of yourself in one day. She stood still, not stamping her feet for warmth, not checking her phone. Just standing there, letting time pass in the cold. The bus stop was quiet. A few people stood spaced apart just far enough. No one spoke. Only the wind and the distant sound of passing cars. Holly breathed out. A thin cloud of vapor appeared, then disappeared almost instantly. She watched it, then let her eyes rest. Some seasons in life feel like a long winter. Not because something is wrong, but because nothing is growing. No clear progress. No sign that warmth is on its way. And what exhausts people most isn't the cold itself, but the fear that it might never end. Holly thought about the past few months. Shift after shift. Coming home after dark, waking up to gray mornings. She wasn't sad in a dramatic way, just quietly worn down like ground that's been frozen for too long. She wrapped her scarf tighter and pulled her sleeves down. A natural reflex. Protection. Warmth. In the cold, the body knows what to do, even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. The bus hadn't arrived. The digital sign blinked, showing a few more minutes. Holly didn't check it again. A few minutes or 10 wouldn't change anything. She stood there listening to her breathing, which grew steadier once she stopped trying to warm herself by constant movement. Someone walked past, leaving behind the faint smell of a damp coat. A car splashed through a puddle, sending up a few drops. The city kept living through its winter, without complaining, without apologizing. Holly remembered past winters. Some had been long, some had felt endless, and yet somehow they had passed. Not in a single day, not with a dramatic sign. Just one morning when the light felt slightly different, the wind less sharp, and she realized she'd made it through the coldest part. She slipped a hand into her coat pocket and touched her knitted gloves. She didn't put them on yet, just touched them. The softness eased the numbness in her fingers a little. A very small warmth, but real. There are fears that whisper, what if it stays like this forever? What if I've gone too far into winter? But winter doesn't ask for answers. It only asks to be walked through one day at a time. Holly looked up at the sky. No stars, just a deep gray stretch. She didn't search for signs of spring in this night. She didn't need to. Night isn't meant to promise anything. It only needs to be quiet enough to stand within. The bus appeared at the end of the street, its white headlights cutting through the dark. It arrived neither sooner nor later than expected. It arrived when it arrived. Holly stepped on, tapped her card, and found a seat near the window. The seat was cold at first, then slowly warmed. She leaned her head against the glass. Her breath fogged a small patch. Outside, the scenery moved past, slowly blurred. Holly didn't try to see it clearly. She didn't need to know exactly where she was passing, only that she was moving. There's something strange about winter, even when everything looks still. Something is always flowing underneath, like roots beneath frozen soil, like water moving under ice, unseen but never stopped. Holly closed her eyes, not to sleep, just to stop meeting the cold with her gaze. As the bus warmed, her body loosened slightly. Maybe this winter wasn't over yet. Maybe it would last a while longer. But that didn't mean it was all there would ever be. The bus moved on at a steady pace, the low hum of the engine like a large heartbeat, keeping the space from falling too quiet. Holly leaned against the window. Her breath fogged the glass once more, then slowly faded. She didn't wipe it away. She let the mark disappear on its own, the way many things in life do when they aren't held on to. Outside, streetlights passed one by one. Light brushed her face, then slid away, never staying long. Holly didn't count them, didn't track them. She let her eyes rest, letting her body be carried without having to stay alert. As the bus warmed, her shoulders dropped, not because she decided to relax, but because the cold that had made her hold herself tight at the stop was no longer pressing in the same way. Some kinds of letting go happen naturally when the conditions change. Holly thought of winter as a necessary pause. No one chooses it. No one schedules it. But when it comes, the body adapts, adding layers, slowing down, staying closer to warmth. Maybe the mind needs similar things. Not big solutions, just small adjustments that make it possible to get through. She remembered a morning from years ago when winter had just begun to turn into spring. There hadn't been dramatic melting, just a shift in light, windows that felt less cold to the touch. And she had known, without needing proof, that the hardest part was behind her. The bus turned onto a familiar street. Holly opened her eyes and looked out. Low houses, windows glowing. Somewhere someone was cooking dinner. Someone else was sitting quietly after a long day. Each home held its own rhythm, no need to match another. She slipped a hand into her pocket, touched her gloves again, then pulled them out and put them on. This time it wasn't because she was too cold. It was because she wanted the warmth more clearly. A small choice, but enough. The fear that winter might never end was no longer standing right in front of her. It hadn't disappeared, but it had stepped back. Winter might still be here, but it wasn't the whole picture. The bus stopped. Holly stood and stepped down. The air outside was colder than inside the bus, but it didn't shock her the way it had earlier. Her body had adjusted. She pulled her scarf up and walked slowly toward home. The porch light turned on as she approached. A small circle of light opened in the darkness. Holly paused for a moment, breathing in, then out. This breath wasn't rushed. It didn't need to be. Some seasons don't ask us to be strong. They only ask us to keep going, to stay warm enough, not to go numb, and to trust that the light will change when it's time. Holly opened the door and stepped inside. The space was warmer, quieter. She took off her coat, hung it up, set her bag down. Familiar movements, gentle ones, like a ritual of bringing her body back home. Outside, winter continued doing its work. But inside this small house, there was warmth enough to rest. And sometimes, one warm space is all it takes to make it through a season. Holly turned off a few lights and walked toward her bedroom. The night didn't ask her to see spring yet. It only asked her to rest so that when spring did arrive, she would still have the strength to notice it. Some anger doesn't come from a big event. It comes from telling a small story too many times. Each time we retell it, we throw another dry branch into the fire. The fire doesn't explode on its own. It simply does what the wood allows it to do. Kevin was 37, an accountant used to tidy numbers and workdays that ended on time. But that evening he got home later than usual. Not because of extra work, just a meeting that ran 10 minutes long, followed by a comment that seemed harmless, said right as everyone stood up to leave. Kevin didn't react then. He smiled lightly, nodded, packed his things. Everything stayed polite. But once he got home, kicked off his shoes by the door, the anger began to take clearer shape. Not loud, just hot. He went straight into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Hot water poured over his shoulders, steam quickly fogging the mirror. The space closed in, leaving only the steady sound of water washing out everything else. Kevin stood there with his eyes closed, letting the water hit his back, the usual end-of-day routine. In his mind, the meeting replayed. Every sentence, every look. Kevin thought about what he should have said, how he should have answered, how he should have clarified things right then. Each should was another dry branch tossed into the fire. The flame didn't flare up immediately, but it grew a little hotter. The water kept running. The steam thickened. Kevin pressed a hand against the tiled wall, warm under his palm. He noticed his jaw was clenched. His shoulders were lifted higher than normal. His body was reacting to a conversation that had already ended. He opened his eyes and looked at the blurred mirror. The reflection was vague, just a figure standing still in the steam. And it hit him. The event was over. But in his head, it was still happening. Edited, expanded, repeated. Sometimes we think we're processing anger by thinking it through, but often we're just feeding it. Every branch is dry because it comes from memory. And memory, when pulled out again and again, catches fire easily. Kevin adjusted the shower, letting the water turn slightly cooler. Not much, just enough to feel the difference. The steam began to thin. The fire in his chest didn't grow anymore. It paused, waiting. He tried something else. He didn't keep retelling the story. He didn't argue in his head. He didn't prepare imaginary responses. He just stood there with the water, with his breath, with a body that was heating up, then slowly cooling down. This felt different from holding it in. It felt like not throwing anything else into the fire. For a few seconds, a kind of quiet appeared. Not outside, but inside. Not a big empty space, just a small opening where the anger wasn't being fed. Kevin noticed that without new wood, the fire changed. It was still there, but it wasn't sharp anymore. He turned off the shower and stepped out, wrapping a towel around himself. Cool air touched his skin clearly. Kevin breathed in, then out. Not deep, not long. Just enough to notice his chest wasn't tight anymore. In the mirror, his reflection slowly came back as the steam faded. Nothing special, no look of triumph. Just someone who had stopped in the middle before the fire could spread. Kevin dried his hair and hung the towel on the hook. Familiar motions, steady, thoughtless. In his mind, the meeting story wasn't running anymore. It still existed, but it wasn't being told. Like embers cooling once no one stirs them. He stepped out into the living room. The light was soft. The space was quiet. Kevin sat down and felt his body sink slightly in a comfortable way. Not exhausted, just no longer tense. Some nights what drains us isn't the first spark of anger. It's all the dry wood we add afterward, believing we're making things clearer. But fire doesn't need clarity. It only needs fuel. Kevin leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. The fire inside him wasn't completely out, but it wasn't being fed anymore. And that alone was enough for the evening to begin to soften. Kevin sat quietly on the sofa. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't pick up his phone. The room was lit only by the soft yellow glow of a lamp in the corner. This space didn't ask him to react, to keep thinking, or to prepare for anything. It simply allowed him to be still. The anger from earlier hadn't disappeared completely. It was still there like glowing embers after the flames have pulled back. But when Kevin didn't stare at it, didn't poke at it, it began to cool on its own. No water needed, no force, just time and quiet. He stood up, went into the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. The sound of water filling the glass was barely audible. Kevin drank in slow sips, feeling his throat soften. Sometimes bringing attention back to the body is the fastest way to stop the mind from spinning. Back on the sofa, Kevin stretched his legs out in front of him. The backrest supported his weight. His shoulders dropped lower than before. His jaw unclenched. Small signs, but his body noticed immediately. It knew when it no longer needed to stay on guard. In Kevin's mind, the meeting from earlier appeared only faintly now. No clear sentences, no chain of imagined replies. When a story isn't repeated, it shortens on its own. Like a fire without wood, first dim red, then gray. He realized something very simple. Not every thought needs to be followed all the way through to be considered processed. Some thoughts finish their work the moment we stop feeding them. Kevin walked into the bedroom. No rush, no phone in hand. He turned on a small lamp just enough to see. As he sat on the bed, he felt the difference between now and when he'd first come home. His body felt heavier in a comforting way, no longer tight like a drawn string. He lay down and pulled the blanket up to his shoulders. The temperature was just right. The room was cool and still. Kevin turned onto his side, finding his familiar position. No thought jumped up demanding to be resolved. What remained was only a faint afterglow, like warmth lingering in a kitchen after cooking is done. Some anger doesn't need to be overcome. It just needs to stop being retold. When the story ends, the fire no longer knows where to burn. Kevin closed his eyes. He didn't force himself to sleep. He let his eyelids grow heavy. His breath moved in then out, steady and even. Each breath felt like a small pause between the remaining thoughts. And in those pauses, his body did what it knows how to do. If tomorrow, when he remembers that meeting, the anger rises again just a little, Kevin knows he'll recognize the familiar moment. This is where I'm about to throw in more wood. And just like tonight, he can choose not to. Not because he's weak, but because it isn't necessary. The room slowly settled into silence. No conclusions, no promises. Just a fire no longer being fed and a body returning to its safe, natural state. And in that quiet sleep arrived naturally, like the last embers finally cooling, leaving just enough warmth to keep the night from feeling cold. Sometimes the problem isn't that things are too complicated. It's that we're in a hurry. We want everything untangled right away. We want our minds to feel clear immediately. We want the discomfort to disappear as fast as possible. And that urgency is often what makes everything more tangled. Chloe is 22 years old. She works retail at a large store. Her shift ends close to 10 at night. When she gets back to her room, she drops into a chair, kicks off her shoes, and pulls her earbuds out of her jacket pocket. The cord is twisted into a small knot, familiar somehow, always like this. Chloe frowns. She tugs gently at one end. Nothing happens. She pulls a little harder. The knot tightens. She exhales sharply, a bit irritated. Why is it always like this? It's a small sentence, but it carries the weight of the whole day. She stands up and paces a few steps around the room, the tangled earbuds still in her hand. Her mind feels just as knotted. A comment from her manager, a difficult customer. A familiar thought slips in. Maybe I'm just not very good at this. The thoughts hook into each other. The more she pulls on them, the tighter they feel. Chloe sits down on the bed. She lets the earbuds fall onto the mattress. She stops pulling. She just looks. Under the warm yellow light, the cord becomes clearer. It isn't one impossible mess. It's just many small loops caught together. She uses 2 fingers to lift a section of the cord, turns it slightly, then sets it back down. Slowly. With no goal of fixing everything at once. Just testing one spot. One small loop loosens. Not much, but enough that the whole knot isn't as tight as before. There's something Chloe knows well, even if she rarely puts it into words. When her mind feels tangled, she tries to solve it fast. Find the right answer. Make a decision immediately. Get clarity now. But just like the earbuds, some things don't respond to force. Pulling harder doesn't move them forward, it just tightens the knot. She keeps going. Lift, turn, set down. No yanking, no tugging. When one loop refuses to budge, she leaves it alone and moves to another place. Strangely, when she stops focusing on the tightest knot, other parts begin to loosen on their own. As she works, her thoughts slow down too. They don't disappear, but they stop crowding each other. She's no longer replaying her manager's words. Not because she's resolved them, but because her hands are busy with something slow enough to bring her back to the present moment. At some point, Chloe notices her shoulders have dropped. Her neck feels less tight. Her exhales are steadier, small changes but real ones. She isn't trying to relax. She simply stopped rushing. Some problems in our minds are exactly like this tangle of earbuds. Not impossible to fix, just impossible to fix with force. They need patience more than determination, and sometimes the biggest step is simply stopping the hard pull. Chloe sets the earbuds down and stretches her hands. She looks out the window. Streetlights reflect off the wet sidewalk below. A car passes, then fades into the distance. Nothing out there is asking anything of her. She turns back to the earbuds. Another loop loosens. Then another. There's no moment where everything is suddenly done. Just a knot that's slowly becoming easier to breathe around, much like her mind right now. If you're listening to this and recognize how often you try to untangle your thoughts too quickly, that's okay. Many people do. But tonight you might not need to pull so hard. You can set things down and loosen them one small step at a time. At some point, Chloe notices the room has grown quieter. Not because all sound has disappeared, but because nothing is pulling her attention too far away anymore. The wall clock ticks steadily. Traffic outside is thinned. The warm yellow light in the room hasn't changed, but the way she feels inside has. The earbuds on the bed are no longer tightly knotted like they were at first. There are still a few small loops tangled together, but they don't irritate her anymore. Chloe lifts one end of the cord, lets the rest fall softly onto the mattress. She doesn't pull. She just raises it, turns her wrist slightly, then sets it down again. Another loop loosens on its own. She realizes she doesn't need to untangle everything right now. The earbuds already work. The rest can wait. That realization feels much lighter than the pressure of having to finish it all. A familiar thought flickers through her mind. I always leave things unfinished. This time Chloe doesn't react. She doesn't blame herself. She doesn't argue back. She lets the thought drift by like a thin strand of wire that no longer catches on anything. She coils the earbuds loosely, not trying to make them neat, just enough to place them in the drawer. When her hand closes the drawer, it feels like she's set down one more thing from the day. Chloe stands and walks into the bathroom. She washes her hands with warm water. The feeling of water running between her fingers helps her notice how tired her hands actually are. Not from heavy work, but from gripping too tightly for too long. As the soap rinses away, her fingers relax on their own. She looks at herself in the mirror, not searching for flaws, not judging, just looking. Someone who's made it through a long day and is learning not to pull so hard at everything anymore. Back in her room, Chloe turns off the main light, leaving only the small lamp by the bed. She sits down, pulls the blanket up to her thighs, then lies back fully. The bed supports her body. She doesn't need to balance herself. She doesn't need to think any further. Some nights, the best thing you can do for yourself isn't to solve every tangle, but to stop making them tighter. No pulling, no yanking, no forcing clarity. If there are still a few loose wires in your mind, that's okay. They don't need to be untangled before sleep. They can stay right where they are, harmless, as long as you don't keep pulling on them. Chloe turns onto her side. Her breathing slows. Not perfectly even, but comfortable. She isn't thinking about tomorrow. She isn't thinking about her next shift. She lets her body do what it already knows how to do: rest. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's completely fine. If you're still awake, you're still moving in a very safe rhythm. You don't need to untangle everything. You don't need full clarity. You only need to release the force and let things stay as they are. Listen a little longer, or drift off whenever you'd like. There are moments when the mind feels crowded, not because anything is wrong, but because everything wants attention at the same time. Thoughts line up, overlap, interrupt each other. One leads to the next so quickly, it's hard to tell where the first one even began. It often happens while driving at night. The road stretches forward, dark and steady. Street lights pass at a regular pace, each one appearing glowing briefly, then slipping behind. The radio is off. The car moves smoothly, almost on its own. Hands rest lightly on the steering wheel, familiar with this route, not needing instructions. Above the windshield, the sky is wide, not perfectly clear. There are clouds drifting across it, thin in some places, heavier in others. They move slowly, quietly changing shape without asking permission. None of them stay for long. At first, they barely register. Attention is still busy elsewhere. A conversation from earlier in the day replays itself. A sentence that could have been said better. A decision that might matter later. The mind jumps ahead, then loops back, then jumps again. It feels important, urgent, like something needs to be solved before the drive ends. Then at a red light, there's a pause. The car stops. The engine idles. The light above glows steadily. And without trying to, the eyes lift slightly, catching the movement of clouds against the night sky. They're just there. No struggle, no rush, no effort to hold their shape. A thought passes through the mind, almost like a whisper. Those are just clouds. It's not a deep insight. Not something to write down or remember. Just an observation. Simple, obvious, and yet it changes something. The next thought that comes doesn't feel as solid as before. It shows up, makes its point, then fades a little at the edges. Another thought follows, then another. But instead of piling on top of each other, they start to feel more like the clouds overhead, passing through a space that isn't affected by them. The sky doesn't tighten when clouds appear. It doesn't get anxious. It doesn't try to push them away or hold on to them longer than necessary. It just stays open. Most people live as if their thoughts are the sky itself. As if every idea, every worry, every mental image defines who they are. So when the clouds get heavy, the whole inner world feels heavy too. But driving under the night sky makes something quietly clear. The clouds move. The sky remains. A truck passes in the opposite lane, headlights flashing briefly through the windshield. The light changes. The car moves again. The road continues. Thoughts still appear. Planning, remembering, imagining. That doesn't stop, but there's more space around them now. They're noticed, not followed. Seen, not argued with. A worry floats by. What if tomorrow doesn't go well? It's there for a moment. Then it drifts. Another thought, I should have handled that differently. It lingers a bit longer, then thins out. Nothing is forced. Nothing is corrected. The mind isn't being trained or disciplined. It's simply being observed from a different place. Like standing back far enough to see the sky instead of staring at a single cloud. There's a subtle relief in that shift. Not excitement, not happiness, just relief. The kind that comes when pressure eases slightly, when effort drops without collapsing. The drive continues. Familiar turns, familiar signs. The body handles it all without commentary. Muscles know what to do. Breath finds its own rhythm. Overthinking usually feels like being inside the clouds, surrounded, limited, unable to see beyond what's right in front of you. But moments like this remind you that there's always more space than the mind suggests. The sky doesn't need to be cleared to be blue. It's blue even when you can't see it. And the mind doesn't need to get rid of thoughts to be at ease. It only needs to stop mistaking them for the whole picture. As the car turns onto a quieter street, the clouds thin out. A patch of open sky appears darker and deeper than the rest. It's been there the entire time, unnoticed, unchanged. The thoughts keep moving. But something underneath stays still. The car slows as it turns onto a quieter road. Fewer streetlights here, longer stretches of darkness between them. The kind of road that feels different at night, even though it's the same one driven every other day. The sky opens up a little more. There are still clouds drifting through, but now they're easier to see. Their edges glow faintly when they pass in front of the moon, then fade back into the dark. They don't seem in a hurry. They don't seem lost. They just move, responding to currents no one inside the car needs to understand. Thoughts continue in much the same way. They arrive, they change shape. They overlap for a moment, then separate again. Some feel heavier than others. Some pass quickly. A few linger, hanging in place like thick clouds that refuse to thin out. But even the heavier ones don't feel as overwhelming anymore. There's a growing sense of distance, not emotional distance, but perspective. The kind that lets things exist without being pulled into them, like watching weather from indoors instead of standing out in the rain. A familiar worry shows up again. The kind that usually grabs attention immediately. The mind starts to lean toward it almost automatically, ready to engage, to solve, to prepare. Then it pauses. The cloud is noticed. That's all. No arguing with it. No pushing it away. No trying to make it disappear. Just noticing that it's there and that it's not the sky itself. Without resistance, the thought loses some of its urgency. It's still present, but it no longer demands a response. It floats alongside the drive instead of taking control of it. The car passes a small park. Empty swings move slightly in the breeze. A single street lamp lights the sidewalk. Everything feels quiet, held in place for the night. This is often how the mind settles, not by becoming empty, but by becoming wide. When attention is narrow, every thought feels intense, important, personal. But when attention widens, thoughts are given room to breathe. They don't need to be contained or fixed. They can come and go on their own. The sky doesn't select which clouds are allowed. It doesn't label them good or bad. It doesn't rush them along or ask them to stay. It simply remains. The body senses this too. The grip on the steering wheel softens slightly. Shoulders drop. The jaw unclenches without instruction. Breathing deepens in a way that feels unplanned. Nothing has changed externally. The road is the same. The destination hasn't moved. Tomorrow is still tomorrow. But the inner experience is different. Overthinking feeds on identification, the belief that every thought needs to be owned, answered, or acted on. When that belief loosens even slightly, the mind finds space it forgot existed. A cloud thickens overhead. For a moment, the moon disappears completely. Darkness deepens. Then slowly the moon reappears at the edge. Light returns. The cloud continues on its way, leaving no trace behind. The sky didn't lose anything while it was hidden. It didn't need to struggle to come back. There's comfort in that. The car pulls into a familiar driveway. The engine turns off. Silence settles in deeper now without the hum of movement. The sky is still there above the roof, unseen but unchanged. Thoughts are still present too. A few last ones hover at the edges of awareness. But they feel less solid than before, less convincing, like clouds seen from far away. The door opens. The night air feels cool against the skin. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then goes quiet. The world seems to be resting. Inside, lights remain off. No need to brighten the space. Darkness feels friendly now, not empty. The sky hasn't gone anywhere, and neither has the space behind the thoughts. They'll return. The clouds always do. Different shapes, different densities, different moods. That's not a problem. What matters is remembering this. You don't have to chase them, fight them, or become them. They can move across you, and you can remain, just like the sky. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe, so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go, drift, and let these truths become your own. My thoughts are settling like sediment in a glass of still water. Go of all ripples. The surface of my mind is becoming glass. Like a river flows to the ocean, my worries flow away from me. obstacles without resistance. The waters of sleep are washing over my tired eyes. Floating in a sea of tranquility, weightless and free. Breath is like the tide, flowing in and flowing out. Deep below the surface waves, my inner ocean is silent. I release the day just as a leaf drifts down a stream. Cool, healing water soothes my nervous system. Merging into the velvet depths of rest. There is no need to swim. I simply float. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. Clear, transparent, and still. I am clear, transparent, and still. Transparent and still. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Water fills a cup. Water fills a cup. Fills me like water fills a cup.